To get us going back to sort of conference mood, we hop all the way to the Netherlands with Martijn coming from there. But actually, Martijn will not speak that much about the Netherlands necessarily, but really give insight from a study that his company, the research team did about how evidence-informed policy is made all around Europe and what are the good practices of that. So, floor is yours, and a bit of facts about Holland.
Good morning. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be introduced with electronic music and to be introduced with a remark about the Amsterdam Internet Exchange rather than, for instance, the Dutch soccer team not participating in the European Championships this summer in France. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for the introduction. As was already mentioned, I'll be talking not so much about a country or national examples, but more provide, let's say, a bigger picture, a broader picture about how data, big data, or other types of innovative data uses, plus data analytics, are actually used in policy making. So here, basically, the challenge in our study was finding out to what extent the link between, on the one hand, the data, and the other hand, the policy process, to what extent that link has been established. What we did is it's a study for the European Commission, DG Connect. Within the European Commission, DG Digit, together with DG Connect, are the two DGs that are sort of trying to make their other colleagues a bit more enthusiastic about how they should innovate, how they should use ICT, how they should use open data, big data, while improving their policies. So DG Connect was our client. When I say our clients, I mean the Technopolis Group, which is where I work, together with the Oxford Internet Institute and the Center for European Policy Studies. So this is basically me telling you the results of our study. And the study was finished this week on Wednesday. And I'll show you later where you have a study website where you can read basically everything we done throughout this 1 year and 5 months. So this is, let's say, what my story is based on. I could not avoid entirely saying something about big data and what it could be, what it could mean, what the definition might look like. This is a very tricky issue. Let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, say that we're talking about a step change in the scale and scope of the sources of materials and the way we are manipulating and using these sources. And the definition comes from our colleague in Oxford, Ralph Schroeder. And it's very compatible with all the definitions that most of you probably know, which are centered around the V's, so volume, variety, et cetera, and just let me also mention that some of the recent works on big data and the definitions also show that it's not necessarily always volume. It might also be that it's more unique thing, which is exhaustivity, which means N is all, rather than sampling. And often, of course, if you have velocity and exhaustivity, it leads to volume, but it might not always be the case. So this is just me just trying to steer a little bit away from a detailed discussion on the definition. For our study, this was more than enough, but what helped even more is that, of course, we could focus on big data for evidence-informed policymaking, which means that we did not look at all sorts of uses in the private sector, so be it the Amazons, etc. What also helped a lot for our study is that we focused on national and international level policymaking. So the idea was that at the regional and local level, so for example, smart cities, there have been many other studies conducted, and things are moving rapidly. And sometimes, of course, at the level of the cities, things are easier to develop and to implement. So I suppose you want to have a sensor network. Well, you can do that at city level, but it's often more challenging to do it at national, let alone international level. So this study focused on the national and international level and see how we are doing right there. Looking at the data, so the data collection, the data sources, the data analytics, the visualization, and the policy making. And with policy making, we used a simple model of the policy cycle. So we also explored to what extent and where in the policy cycle these new data-driven approaches are being used. And lastly, to scope and position our study, to some extent we looked at, let's say, uses at the intersection of small data or big data. So we've been a little bit flexible there, but we didn't go into the details of related matters such as citizen science, participative policy making, open data, system dynamics modeling, etc. So, but these, of course, these areas did pop up in our studies and also in the concrete initiatives that we looked at. We did several things, of course. We talked to a number of thought leaders across the world. We did our desk research. So we did our homework, basically. But then what we ventured on to do more explicitly in the first part of our study, which was done first half of last year. So summer 2015, one of our first deliverables was published. What we did there more specifically is we made an inventory of relevant operational initiatives. And here we mean that it's a data-driven initiative that is operational, so it's actually being used or implemented by a policymaker, or about to be used, so very close to implementation, which also means that we didn't look at in great detail at the many research projects or technical pilots or experiments, let's say the ad hoc studies, because as most of you know, many things are going on right now. It's just that we were interested in whether all these nice studies and experiments were actually already being used in the practice of policymaking. So that's how we got to our 58 operational initiatives. That's why we focused there. And we found them basically by internet searches, contacting 5, 6, 7 policymakers, experts in each of the European countries, also looking at Canada, Singapore, Korea, US. So we contacted many persons. We used LinkedIn discussion groups. We even published our draft inventory online and basically twittering and sending out messages saying, well, if you want to be in with your initiative, please send us a message and we add you. So this is how we got there. And of course, we described all the initiatives in terms of their status, who is responsible, the policy areas, policy cycle, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it's not fully representative, but I think it gives a good picture about where we are in terms of really implementing. To give you a couple of examples, the digital delta, in the Netherlands, we're concerned about water to a large extent. It's sometimes threatening even for us. So we've had several examples where the policymakers at national level, together with their specialized agencies, together with research organizations, private partners, so really developed sustainable long-term partnerships, deploying sensor data, all sorts of other geodata, administrative data, etc. So linking data sets. So here it's to some extent the new data source, which is sensors in this case, linking it to much more established data sources and running it, let's say, at a more permanent basis and coming up with real-time analysis, for example, where the different dikes are being threatened. So we also talk about smart dikes, as we call it here. But then another example is from Canada, which is again in the field of geospatial data. And some of the interesting things there is that the mix of data sources, sometimes we talk about big data when the mix of data sources is becoming richer and richer. The mix here also includes satellite data. So this is an example for Canada. And in our report, we described all these examples with descriptions, web links, et cetera, so you can see there. Let me mention some examples in the field of research and innovation policy. To some extent, was also already addressed by our guest, our professor from Hungary before the break, is that if you look at research and innovation, many universities, firms, research organizations, they are getting funded from very different sources, be it European, national, regional, etc. Increasingly, these databases are being linked, so we have an ever better picture about which innovation actor is funded by which public support program, and how ultimately, altogether, that leads to specific output or impact of this research actor. So, for example, a university. So the JRC, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, has developed the Research and Innovation Observatory, which is in this field. In the US, it's the STAR Metrics data set. And what I also want to mention is the Spanish example, which is even more interesting, not just because it focuses on the ICT sector, which is also my favorite sector to do research on, but also because they even further stretch the type of data sources they use. So also including, for example, looking at websites of ICT companies, so they do web scraping, they do social media analysis, they look at blogs, news items, etc., to see whether the organizations that provided most of the funding also actually are hiring most of the new employees, or whether they're being mentioned most often in news articles. So really tracing from funding research and innovation to having innovative companies to having more employees and an impact on the economy and society. So this is again an example of what you can do, and of course using these data sets, the policies of these research and development policymakers in Spain are being improved, monitored, tested at least every year. The last three examples I want to mention before I give you some, let's say, broader ideas across the 58. So these are just, again, to give you some specific examples. Open Fisca is a French initiative. And what's one of the innovative elements there is that the citizens, so the users, they can play with the system themselves. And they can also use and adapt the software that's being used for that. And what you can do then actually is see how the tax benefit system in France plays out for you as a person if something's changed in your personal life. But the system can also be used to calculate how changes in the system will have an impact on specific groups of citizens. So for example, you're a politician or you're a lobbyist, you can play with the system to sort of support your arguments before Parliament while, for example, making a plea about changing the healthcare system or the social security system. The Groningen Declaration Network, one of the innovative elements there, and I think this is quite an important thing in the field of big data, is that the ownership of the data here is with the students. So this is an initiative, I think there have now over more than 15 countries engaged, so they try to implement this in more countries. The idea is that a student has its ownership of his data, and the data can come from the different educational organizations, and it's the student himself or herself who can give access, for example, to a company in a job application procedure. So you can say, I'm applying to this Estonian firm, and I'm okay if this and that information is shared in the context of my application procedure. But again, the control stays with the student and not with the school and not with the company. Lastly, and there are examples not just in the Netherlands, but also in Denmark and other countries, is vehicle detection loops, which is, let's say, the loops underneath the roads, which can tell you a lot about traffic, how many, how often, what times of the day, etc., etc. But one of the interesting things is that this is now increasingly being linked again to other data sources, which includes mobile phone data. So you can have even better predictions about congestion, for example. So these are just to give you some examples, some flavor about the kind of initiatives we looked at in our inventory. And then a bit of an overview is in which part of the policy cycles these initiatives can be located. So basically, where is the data being used in the policy cycle? Well, what struck us quite clearly is that it's mostly in the first half of the policy process. So you use these data to think about new issues, new problems coming up, new stakeholders entering the field. You do some agenda setting, some lobbying, some putting things higher on the agenda. To some extent, it's being used for problem analysis, a bit more for monitoring than for interim evaluation. So you sort of track and trace what's going on with transport or traffic or education, etc. But it's not yet being used for policy evaluation or impact assessment. And we of course, it can be explained in the sense that if you go to policy evaluation, impact assessment, having financial implications as well, of course, that's where the proof of the pudding is, so that's also where your evidence base has to be much stronger. It's difficult to sort of judge a research institute or evaluate a social security policy rather than it is to do a foresight about emerging trends. The implications are just more substantial. So this is the use across the policy cycle. In terms of data sources, administrative data, so open data, well, for us, that was not a big surprise. That scored quite heavily in these innovative initiatives. Statistical offices, basically, some of them already reinventing themselves, being more open, being more innovative, jumping onto sensor data, social media data, etc. Large-scale surveys, let's say bespoke surveys, we also saw them often as part of the data mix. And in these implemented initiatives, there was not yet a lot of social media data or, for example, commercial or traded data like the example I provided on mobile phone data. For example, the mobile phone data example was a deal with Vodafone, which happens ever more, these sort of public-private data coalitions. But in the things that are really implemented, these are not yet there, but they are to a large extent being addressed in the research projects. So if we would do this inventory again in 2 years or in 3 years, we expect that these kind of data sources are becoming more prominent. So it's a matter of phasing. They're in the innovation phase and not, or let's say in the research phase and not yet in the implementation phase. So that's on the data sources. And just to mention that not all data is open. I think we've all been a little bit more nuanced about the open data discourse. And also just to mention that data linking is becoming the norm. We see ever less initiatives that just use one data source. This was a little bit of a surprise to us, is the types of data analysis. It's mostly confined to descriptive statistics and trend analysis. We had expected or even had hoped to have a little bit more on predictive analytics, sentiment mining, all sorts of more profiling, all sorts of forecasting that you can imagine, but not there yet. As I said, not yet implemented. Again, this is where a lot of the research is taking place, so we will see this happening, and also this morning we got some examples already. But again, this is where we think things will change. Then we had a workshop September last year, and I want to share some conclusions with you, because the study was not just about, let's say, describing the state of the art, but also discussing how to move forward and what the issues there were. And I think the main lesson for us we took out of the workshop is the project is called Data for Policy, but most of the participants said that we should actually talk more about policy for data, which means that the policy context, the guidelines, the codes of conduct, the regulations are so crucial for really implementing these data-driven approaches. And you can think of data ownership, privacy, security, data standardization. Everyone said, if you want to move forward with data for policy, you should invest in policy for data. So that was, let's say, at the aggregated level, the conclusion. One of the risks mentioned was we might underestimate the impact. Yeah, so even from my story, you could say, well, things are not going that rapidly, but I think that will be underestimating the impact. If you think ahead 1 or 2 or 3 years, you'd see most of the things that are now in the research phase actually being implemented, at least across Europe. The no black boxing thing was another important aspect. If you're a bookseller online, it's not crucial that you explain each and every step of your analytical process and how you recommend a specific user to buy another book. But if you're a policymaker and if you're basing your decisions on that, you have to be transparent, accurate, you have to be inclusive in the sense that you also cover those parts of the community that are not maybe online or on social media. You also have to take into account their signals and their preferences. So many more things to be discussed there and to be taken care of. Skills, of course, and not just in the development side, so not just as we call it, the data scientists or however you want to call them, but also on the receiving end of the side. So let's say basically saying policymakers and others having a bigger absorptive capacity, so understanding of what all these data analytics mean before they start using it in policymaking. So skills, of course, then not just playing around with all the fancy data that's available, but also really thinking, is this data relevant? So start with your intervention logic. Why is this policy there? What are the indicators? What are the target groups, etc.? And then find out whether you can find the data rather than just say, fantastic, Vodafone is willing to share data. How can we use it? Yeah, that's one part of the story, but the other part is which data do you really, really need? Then lies, statistics, and big data. Of course, lobbying also playing a part in the big data field. Policy for data, as I mentioned. And if you have policy experiments in a specific region or country, it's a perfect context to also learn a bit more about big data. This is the part where I just refer to our website. In collaboration with the European Commission, and this is the part that we finished only last week, we developed 10 use cases in saying, knowing all the things we know and knowing also what's going on in the research projects, also in Horizon 2020 or FP7, how could the European Commission itself accelerate and use more data-driven approaches? Well, together with them, we developed 10 use cases. So a use case meaning it's not there yet, but we see some first ideas and signals, and these can be developed and implemented in the next 2, 3, 4 years. So this is just, again, meant to inspire the various policymakers across the European Commission and across the member states. So here are 10 cases, and I mean, just to give you an idea, web scraping for consumer policy. There are rules about pre-ticked boxes in consumer policy. Yeah? For example, if you buy a Ryanair ticket, you don't want all the boxes to be ticked. Yes, I need insurance. Yes, I need 3 suitcases, etc., etc. You can use web scraping to see if they actually adhere to these rules. So this is just one little example. So in all the 10 cases, you see examples of new data sources or new analytical approaches and how they can be used in policy making. Lastly, again, to sort of enthuse the policy community, we developed one of these 10 use cases into a demonstrator, an online demonstrator. And again, you can go to the website and play with it. And we chose here the issue of our little friends, the bees. Because the health of bees is so crucial for agricultural conditions, food safety, economic development, safety, security, etc., etc. We use the demonstrator basically to illustrate how you can use different data sources, link it, and analyze them. And we started in the mix, we started with sensor data at the level of the beehive. So really think of a beehive with a sensor in it, measuring the humidity, the noise, the weight, etc. So as the hives get noisier and heavier, usually it's a good sign for the bees. So that's one of the elements in the data mix. We also added regional and national administrative data, for example, cropland use. If it's too monotonous, it's usually bad news for the bees, so bad news for us. We also used national data about bee mortality, use of pesticides, again, cropland use, but also policy and regulation. So we basically have policy trend lines saying which countries have implemented which policies and regulations to protect the health of their bees. So this, again, is in a mix of data sets. And if you have all that together, you can do different types of explorative analysis to see how, in a specific region or country, bee health is progressing and how that might be explained. And of course, you can use that to discuss policy options or the effectiveness of existing policy. So this is just an illustration how one of these 10 use cases could be made a little bit more lively and concrete. So again, you can play with it. And this is basically where from this week, from last Wednesday, I should admit, onwards, everything is. So you can read about, let's say, the 58 initiatives. You can read about the workshop report. You can link to the bee health demonstrator. And hopefully you then, as we did throughout the study, have a better view about how we will get from all these nice, fancy things being tested in research environments to the ones that are being actually implemented by policymakers and the various challenges that we have to address to overcome this quite normal innovation gap or innovation process. Thank you.
Good stuff. All right. So quite a lot of thorough research and coverage, actually. So who wants to ask something from Martijn? I think the regular sort of question that always sort of comes up at the end of the research studies is that every good researcher says, okay, what has to be the next research? So based on what you did, I think what would be cool to look into, what would be really sort of useful to look into in terms of best practices, going deeper or wider or?
Yeah, that's a very valid, very valid question. For me, it is about, as I already hinted to, in innovation processes, it's quite normal that the step from research to actually implementation, that's sometimes a tough step. And it can be in pharma or medicine, it can be in launching new educational programs. So I think also in this type of innovation, so innovating the policy process, this step is crucial. And I think it would be very important to look at specific, let's say, institutional issues. So let's say the layers of policy, the stovepipes of policy, to see to what extent they can drive or even hinder this process of implementation. So really going into the implementation phase. And also I think it's right, this study has covered a huge terrain to dive into a number of specifics related, for example, to skills and privacy. Because we can all say that skills are important and privacy is an issue, but how then exactly and for which data sources and which analytics? So more detail and more towards implementation.
Right, and I think especially as you mentioned, so the policy around sort of data is actually what's can be really much an enabler, right? So I mean, going into best practices specifically in that, for example, right? Okay, any questions? Yes, Dan.
Thank you, very inspiring. What methods would you propose to actually convince politicians to use data for policy making instead of intuition?
The politician in you has to answer now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you say instead of using intuition, you might indeed also have a subtle reference to that we already have a lot of data for many, many years, and it's not always the case that that data is being used in the policy process. So it's indeed, this is a persistent challenge. I think a couple of things can help. First of all is to really show, don't tell. So for example, we've had beautiful experiments from Hungary, and also we've talked about the bee health, so I think that helps. And also I think what would really help is, these days especially, if you would also demonstrate that the data that you can use, for example, with social media or web scraping or sensors, is not just better and more timely, but it's also cheaper to collect. I think these days this is a selling argument if you say it's cheaper. If, for example, by mining social media or mining the web, you can tell something about sentiments in society, possible unemployment in specific regions, if you can do that quicker and cheaper and show it, then you can make that little step. But I mean, politicians have many other ways or things on which they base their decisions.
All right, thank you.